Picture this. It's the summer of 1945, and you are deep in the sweltering malarial jungles of Southeast Asia.
Oh, just a miserable place to be if you're not used to it.
Totally. And you are an American intelligence officer, and you've
Mhm.
just parachuted into this encampment to meet with a local guerrilla leader.
Right, like a classic spy movie setup.
Exactly. And your mission is to provide this rebel commander with modern weapons, tactical training, and, logistical support.
Okay.
So you spend weeks with him.
Building an underground network, right?
Yeah, getting to know his fighters, treating his illnesses, aligning your mutual goals. It sounds like a totally standard covert ops story, except the guerrilla leader you are arming is Ho Chi Minh.
Wow. Yeah.
And you, the American agent, are laying the very early groundwork for a military force that will, a few decades later, engage the United States in one of the most, devastating and consequential conflicts of the 20th century.
It really is one of the most profound, almost tragic ironies in modern geopolitics. And honestly, it is the absolute perfect place to start our deep dive today.
I completely agree.
Because you really cannot understand the Vietnam War without understanding that singular moment of alignment.
Right. And that is why we are here today.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because usually when you think about the Vietnam War, you don't think about 1945.
No, not at all.
Your mind instantly goes to a very specific, highly curated set of cultural touchstones. It's almost cinematic for most of us.
You mean like the helicopters and the music?
Exactly. You hear that rhythmic thud of Huey helicopters skimming over a dense jungle canopy, or you picture the sprawling, chaotic anti-war protests taking over college campuses back in the States.
Draft cards being burned, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the draft lottery. And there is almost certainly a soundtrack of 1960s counterculture rock and roll echoing in the background of your mind.
Oh, yeah, always.
It's an era that feels deeply familiar, because it's been just completely burned into our collective popular memory.
It's highly visual, and it is highly emotional. And because of that intense cultural imprint, I think we tend to view the entire conflict through this very narrow, almost mythological lens.
Right. The sheer reality gets flattened.
Exactly. It gets flattened down into a montage of iconic, albeit horrific, images.
But then you actually step into the history. You look at the raw data, the declassified internal memos, the shifting geopolitical strategies, and the day-to-day realities of the people who actually lived it.
And suddenly that familiar cinematic narrative just completely falls
It
apart.
totally does. You realize you are standing at the edge of historical landscape that is, honestly, it's dizzying. So today, we are going to peel back the layers to look at the sheer, terrifying geopolitical complexity that exists beneath those cultural touchstones.
It really is the absolute definition of a geopolitical labyrinth.
Yeah.
The deeper you go into the actual mechanics of the conflict, the more you realize that the narrative we hold in our heads barely scratches the surface.
Barely even touches it.
Right. I mean, it barely touches what was actually happening on the ground, in the war rooms, and in the minds of the combatants. This conflict wasn't just a military struggle, which is how it's, so often taught in high school.
Yeah, a bunch of dates and battles.
Exactly. It was actually a profound existential crisis of political legitimacy. It was a massive intelligence failure. And above all, it was a clash of fundamentally incompatible strategies.
So our mission for this deep dive is to shortcut that overwhelming volume of history. We are going to extract the core narrative from our sources today.
Which is much needed, because the sheer amount of source material is daunting.
Oh, it's massive. We are going to track exactly how a localized post-colonial struggle in Southeast Asia morphed, mutated, and escalated into this massive Cold War proxy war.
A war that pulled in the world's nuclear superpowers, devastated millions of lives, and fundamentally altered the global order.
Right. You really can't view it as a single event. It's more like a cascading series of dominoes. And yes, pun totally intended there, where it seems like every single solution the global powers came up with only created a vastly worse, more intractable problem down the line.
That is a perfect way to frame it. The domino analogy is incredibly apt, not just because of the political theory of the time, but because of how the decisions themselves cascaded.
Right. One bad choice leading to another.
Precisely. Because to truly understand the American war in Vietnam, we actually have to travel back in time and look at the French War.
Okay, let's go there.
And to understand the French War, we have to look at how World War II completely shattered the illusion of European colonial invincibility.
So let's set the stage for you listening. The region we now call Vietnam had been under French control since the late 19th century. It was part of what was known as French Indochina.
Which also included modern-day Laos and Cambodia.
Right. And for the French, this was a massive economic engine. They were extracting rubber, rice, minerals, often using brutal forced labor. But then World War II erupts. In 1940, Nazi Germany rolls into Paris and France capitulates.
Leaving their colonies incredibly vulnerable.
Exactly. The door is wide open.
And Imperial Japan, which is already expanding its own empire across the Pacific, sees a golden opportunity. So Japan invades French Indochina.
But they do something weird, right? They don't just kick the French out.
No, they don't immediately dismantle the French colonial apparatus. Instead, they establish this incredibly bizarre, tense, dual colonial rule. They allow the Vichy French administration—
That's the government collaborating with the Nazis back in Europe, right?
Exactly. They allow them to remain in place and handle the day-to-day administration of the colony. Meanwhile, the Japanese military uses Indochina as a strategic staging ground for their wider war efforts in the Pacific.
So if you're a Vietnamese citizen at this time, you have two empires essentially sitting on top of you at the exact same time.
Just an incredibly oppressive, volatile mix.
And into this mix steps a man named Nguyen Sinh Kung, who would later become known to the entire world as Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh is such a fascinating, complex, historical figure. He had actually left Vietnam decades earlier. He worked on ships, lived in Paris, New York, London.
He was a global citizen, basically.
Very much so. He was even present at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. He was literally trying to petition Woodrow Wilson for Vietnamese civil rights.
Wait, really? He tried to talk to the U.S. president in 1919.
He did, and he was completely ignored.
Yeah.
So he eventually goes to Moscow, embraces communism, and establishes the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930.
Ah, okay.
What made him so potent, though, was his ability to flawlessly blend fierce revolutionary nationalism with Marxist-Leninist organizational ideology.
Right. He saw communism not just as an economic theory, but as a practical anti-colonial tool to win independence.
Exactly. It was a means to an end.
So, during the Japanese occupation in World War II, Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam from exile. He forms a broad anti-Japanese, anti-French resistance movement called the Viet Minh. And this brings us back to that mind-blowing aha moment we mentioned at the very start of the show.
Yes. The United States enters World War II after Pearl Harbor, and they are looking for any allies they can find in the Pacific theater to disrupt Japanese operations.
Anybody who can hold a rifle and hates the Japanese, basically.
Right. And the U.S. military intelligence agency at the time was the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the direct precursor to the CIA.
And the OSS looks at the map of Indochina, and they realize the only effective anti-Japanese resistance network operating on the ground is Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh.
So in 1945, an OSS unit known as the Deer Team parachutes into Ho Chi Minh's jungle headquarters.
Just incredible to picture that.
It is. They bring medics, they bring modern weaponry, and they bring training. American intelligence officers are actively arming Ho Chi Minh's forces, teaching them guerrilla tactics to fight the Japanese.
The irony is just staggering when you look back at it. The United States and the Viet Minh shared a common immediate enemy, and the OSS officers on the ground actually grew quite fond of Ho Chi Minh.
They really did.
Yeah, I read in the source material that they referred to him as an awfully sweet guy in their internal cables. They saw him primarily as a patriot who just wanted independence for his people.
But, you know, this geopolitical alignment was incredibly brief. It was dictated entirely by the immediate pressures of a global world war.
Because things move incredibly fast in 1945. By March, the Japanese realize they are losing the wider war in the Pacific. They fear the French in Indochina might turn against them as the Allies advance, so Japan launches a lightning coup.
They violently overthrow the French colonial government.
Right, they imprison the French administrators and set up a puppet state. But then just a few months later, in August, after the atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan formally surrenders to the Allies.
Which creates a massive sudden power vacuum in Indochina. I mean, the French are locked up, the Japanese have surrendered, and there is suddenly no central authority at all.
And Ho Chi Minh does not hesitate for a second. The Viet Minh instantly seize that vacuum. They launch what becomes known as the August Revolution.
They march right into Hanoi, taking weapons from the surrendering Japanese troops.
And on September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stands before a massive crowd in Hanoi and formally declares the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV. And get this, He literally starts his speech by quoting the American Declaration of Independence.
All men are created equal.
Yes, he is clearly hoping that the United States, given their recent wartime cooperation, will recognize his new government and support them.
But the geopolitical winds of the post-war world shifted almost instantly, leaving Ho Chi Minh entirely behind.
The honeymoon was over.
Exactly. The Allies, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union had already made agreements about how to handle the post-war territories. The decision was made that Indochina needed to be stabilized.
Which is always a loaded word in international relations.
Oh, absolutely. So, British forces arrive in the south of Vietnam, and Chinese nationalist troops arrive in the north, simply to oversee the disarmament and repatriation of the Japanese soldiers.
But the British commander in the south takes it a step further, doesn't he?
He does. He actively helps rearm the French prisoners of war. He supports a French coup in Saigon to help France violently reassert its colonial control.
Unbelievable. And the OSS team.
Ordered to pack up and withdraw, the brief American-Vietnamese alliance is officially over.
So why did the U.S. let that happen? Why turn their backs on Ho Chi Minh after fighting together?
Well, France was a crucial ally for the United States in the emerging post-war order in Europe. The U.S. needed a strong France to act as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in Western Europe.
Right, the Cold War logic is starting to boot up.
Exactly. So, despite Franklin Roosevelt's earlier misgivings about European colonialism, the Truman administration ultimately decides to look the other way. They allow France to reclaim its empire in Southeast Asia.
It is just incredible to pause and think about how different the 20th century might have been if that OSS relationship had continued, or if Truman had recognized Ho Chi Minh's government in 1945.
A massive historical what-if.
But instead, the door slams shut, France returns, and we get the First Indochina War. From 1946 onward, it is a brutal, full-scale colonial war between the Viet Minh and the French military.
And it's really important to understand the internal dynamics here, too, because the Viet Minh were not just fighting the French.
Right. They were also busy eliminating their local competition.
Yes. They were systematically terrorizing, assassinating, and purging rival Vietnamese nationalist groups, moderate politicians, and Trotskyists. They wanted to ensure they had an absolute monopoly on the resistance movement.
Right. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, sure, but he was also a hardened, ruthless political operator who would tolerate zero opposition.
Absolutely zero.
So the early years of this First Indochina War were largely a localized anti-colonial struggle. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire nature of the conflict fundamentally transforms in the years 1949 and 1950.
That's right, because the Cold War is freezing over globally. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces win the Chinese Civil War.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive. Suddenly, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh have a massive, well-armed, highly sympathetic communist neighbor directly to their north.
The border between China and Vietnam opens up, and in January 1950, the People's Republic of China officially recognizes Ho Chi Minh's DRV as the legitimate government of Vietnam.
And a few days later, the Soviet Union follows suit and recognizes them as well.
And Washington absolutely panics.
Oh, complete institutional panic. You have to put yourself in the mindset of an American policymaker in 1950.
The anxiety must have been off the charts.
It was. They had just lost China to communism, in their view. The Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb. The U.S. is in the absolute grip of the Red Scare, with Senator Joe McCarthy whipping up domestic paranoia about communist infiltrators.
Right, and then in June of 1950, communist North Korea invades South Korea.
Exactly. So to Washington, Ho Chi Minh is no longer viewed as just an obscure colonial rebel. He is viewed as a direct tentacle of a monolithic global Soviet-Chinese conspiracy to conquer the world.
And this triggers the Truman Doctrine, right?
Yes, the policy that the U.S. must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Indochina is suddenly viewed as the critical front line of global communist expansionism.
So as a direct countermove, the United States and the Western Bloc formally recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam, which is based in the south in Saigon, as the legitimate government.
And they install the former Vietnamese emperor, Bao Dai, as a political figurehead,
Right.
basically to give it a veneer of local legitimacy.
So, in the blink of an eye, this localized anti-colonial war has been fully internationalized into a massive Cold War proxy conflict.
The Chinese start sending military advisors, heavy weapons, and laborers to the Viet Minh. This fundamentally transforms them from a ragtag guerrilla force into a highly organized conventional army capable of massive logistical feats.
And in response to that, the U.S. opens its checkbook. They start pouring unprecedented amounts of money into the French war effort. By 1954, the United States had spent $1 billion in Indochina.
Which was an astronomical sum back then.
Right. They were literally paying for an astonishing 80% of the entire French war cost.
The U.S. essentially bankrolled the French Empire's dying breaths. But, no amount of American money could fix the sheer tactical realities on the ground.
Money doesn't win battles on its own.
Exactly. Nor could it fix the overwhelming unpopularity of the French colonial regime among the Vietnamese peasantry. And this total failure of strategy culminates in late 1953 and early 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
Okay, this battle is legendary for all the wrong reasons if you are the French military. The French High Command decides to set up a massive, heavily fortified garrison in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, right near the border of Laos.
Their logic was essentially to create a giant trap.
A trap for the Viet Minh.
Right. They wanted to draw the elusive Viet Minh out of the jungle and into a massive set-piece battle where superior French artillery and air power could completely crush them.
The arrogance of the French command was staggering here. They looked at this valley, surrounded by steep, densely forested mountains, and they assumed it was physically impossible for the Viet Minh to bring heavy artillery through that terrain.
They assumed they owned the high ground because they owned the air.
Right. But they vastly underestimated the sheer willpower and logistical genius of the Viet Minh commander, General von Nguyen Giap. The Viet Minh didn't just march to the valley.
No, they mobilized tens of thousands of peasants.
They literally disassembled heavy artillery pieces, tied them to bicycles, and dragged them by hand, inch by inch, through the muddy jungle and up the steep mountainsides.
It's hard to even picture that level of physical exertion.
Just staggering. And then they dug deep camouflaged bunkers into the forward slopes of the mountains, pointing directly down into the French base.
They completely encircled the French. They brought in anti-aircraft batteries to cut off the French supply planes. When the battle finally began, the French commander of artillery were so shocked by the volume and accuracy of the incoming Viet Minh fire that he actually committed suicide in his bunker.
Wow. Just the sudden realization of total doom.
Yeah, it was a slow, agonizing strangulation of the French forces.
It's a catastrophic defeat. The siege lasts for nearly 2 months. The mud, the monsoon rains, the endless artillery barrages. There were actual serious discussions in Washington and Paris about the United States intervening with tactical nuclear weapons just to save the French garrison.
It was called Operation Vulture.
Think about how terrifying that is. Using atomic bombs in a jungle valley to save a doomed colonial outpost.
President Eisenhower ultimately vetoed the idea, thankfully. He realized the political fallout would be disastrous and, frankly, it wouldn't solve the underlying political failure.
Right, so without American intervention, the French garrison finally surrenders in May 1954. The shock wave of this defeat completely breaks the political will in Paris. The French public has had enough.
This forces all the major world powers to the negotiating table at the Geneva Conference in the summer of 1954. And this is where the map of Vietnam, as we know it for the rest of the war, is literally drawn with a pencil.
Right. At Geneva, they agree to a formal ceasefire. The French agree to withdraw their troops, and they decide to temporarily partition the country in half at the 17th parallel.
Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces are given administrative control of the north, operating out of Hanoi.
And the French-backed, non-communist state of Vietnam gets control of the south, operating out of Saigon.
But it is crucial to understand for our listeners that this division was explicitly intended by the drafters to be a temporary military demarcation line. It was not a permanent political boundary.
So it wasn't supposed to be two separate countries forever.
No, not at all. The Geneva Accords specifically called for national, UN-supervised elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the entire country under a single democratically chosen government.
So wait, the Geneva Conference was basically less of a lasting peace treaty and more of a geopolitical pause button.
There's exactly what it was. A pause button to stop the immediate bleeding. And it was a pause button that was fundamentally doomed from the very moment it was pressed.
Why doomed?
Well, you have to look at the motivations of the players involved. Why would Ho Chi Minh, who just won a massive military victory at Dien Bien Phu, agree to give up half the country?
Right, he had all the momentum.
He did. He was actually pressured into it by his own allies. The Soviets and the Chinese wanted to avoid provoking a direct military confrontation with the United States at that specific moment. So they convinced Ho Chi Minh to accept the temporary division, assuring him that with his popularity as a national hero, He would easily win the nationwide elections in 2 years anyway.
But the United States didn't buy that for a second, did they?
Not at all. The United States and the state of Vietnam in the South didn't even sign the Geneva Accords. They only observed.
U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles vehemently objected to giving the communists any territory at all.
And the new Southern leader, Nung Dinh Diem, completely rejected the proposed 1956 elections. He argued quite accurately, actually, that free and fair elections were entirely impossible in the totalitarian, communist-controlled North.
Which is a valid point. The Cold War logic of the time dictated everything. Neither Washington nor Moscow could actually afford to lose their respective half of the country in a risky democratic election.
Exactly. So the elections were a complete fiction from day one.
Which leaves us with this incredible question. What does this all mean for the millions of people actually living there? The French are packing up and leaving. The country is suddenly split in half by an arbitrary line.
We enter this incredibly tense transition period from 1954 to roughly 1963, where these two deeply ideologically opposed Vietnams scramble to solidify their societies.
And this era begins with a massive, traumatic demographic shift. The Geneva Accords allowed for a 300-day period of free movement. Anyone who wanted to move north or south across the 17th parallel was theoretically allowed to do so.
And what resulted was a massive exodus. Roughly 1 million Northerners migrated to the South.
Who were these people moving?
The vast majority of these were Catholics, but it also included Buddhists, wealthy landowners, and ethnic minorities.
Now, if you dig into the declassified files in our sources, the CIA, specifically under Alan Dulles, ran covert psychological operations to actively encourage this migration.
Right? They sent agents into the North to spread rumors of an impending American atomic attack on Hanoi, or they'd spread leaflets saying things like the Virgin Mary had moved south.
But the historical consensus shows that while the CIA absolutely tried to take credit for this massive movement, because of course they did, these psyops actually played a minimal role.
Yeah, the CIA operations were really a drop in the bucket compared to the reality on the ground. Most of these people moved because of their own deeply held religious and political convictions. They had seen the Viet Minh's ruthlessness firsthand.
They knew what was coming.
They were fleeing the very real prospect of communist rule, which historically did not tolerate organized religion or private land ownership.
And that massive influx of 1 million northern emigres provided a huge, immediate boost of fervent, uncompromising anti-communist sentiment in the South. This was a demographic base that the new Southern leader, Nung Dinh Diem, relied upon heavily to build his power base.
Let's talk about Nung Dinh Diem, because his leadership really defines the South during this era. In 1955, a year after Geneva, Diem decides he needs to establish his own mandate. He holds a national referendum to determine the future of the state.
Specifically, whether to keep the former emperor Bao Dai as the head of state, or to oust him and become a republic with Diem as president.
And Diem doesn't just win this election. He rigs it.
He rigs it so spectacularly that it almost becomes a dark comedy. He wins 98% of the vote nationwide. And in the capital city of Saigon, he famously tallies 133% of the vote.
He claimed more votes than there were registered voters in the entire city.
It's just wild. It was an astonishing display of hubris.
His American advisors had actually pleaded with him beforehand. They told him, just aim for 60 to 70%. Make it look somewhat believable to the international community.
But Diem didn't understand Western democratic optics.
It's not at all. He views the election not as a choice for the people, but as a test of his absolute authority. He felt a 98% margin was required to show total dominance. Following this farce, he declares the creation of the Republic of Vietnam, with himself as its first president.
Diem is a fascinating contradiction, honestly. On one hand, he was a staunch, unyielding anti-communist and a devout Catholic, which Washington absolutely loved.
But on the other hand, he was incredibly authoritarian, paranoid, and nepotistic, which Washington found incredibly frustrating.
He immediately began consolidating his power by ruthlessly eliminating any political opposition. And he didn't just target communists, he targeted anyone who wasn't loyal to him.
He had to establish control over a deeply fractured society. He launched military campaigns to crush powerful, heavily armed religious sects like the Cao Dai and the Hoa Hao, who basically ran their own fiefdoms.
He even engaged in a literal explosive battle in the streets of Saigon to destroy the Binh Xuyen. That was a massive organized crime syndicate that essentially controlled the city's police force and vice trade.
He wins those early battles, which initially impresses the Americans, but then he institutionalizes the paranoia. He launches a massive denounced the communists' campaign.
He passes draconian laws, too, like Law 1059. This made any act of political violence or even suspected subversion punishable by death by a roving military tribunal.
By 1959, looking at the historical data, his regime had jailed an estimated 40,000 political prisoners. It was essentially a police state.
Meanwhile, what is happening up north?
The North, under Ho Chi Minh, is taking a different but equally brutal path to consolidate power. They are strictly adhering to orthodox Marxist-Leninist principles to establish total control over the population. Between 1953 and 1956, they institute sweeping, deeply harsh agrarian land reforms.
The mechanics of this are just terrifying. Communist cadres would enter a village, classify the population into specific socioeconomic tiers, and then forcibly strip land from anyone designated a landlord or a rich peasant.
And it wasn't just expropriation of property. The cadres organized people's tribunals, where villagers were pressured to denounce their neighbors. Those deemed class enemies or traitors were systematically executed.
And when you look at the historical records, it is important to report the numbers here impartially because the data has actually shifted over time as new archives have opened up.
Right. Early estimates, which were widely accepted by Western scholars for decades, put the number of executions during this land reform anywhere from 50,000 to over 100,000 people.
However, later archival evidence, specifically from internal Vietnamese and Hungarian diplomatic sources, indicates that the actual number of executions was likely lower than those massive Cold War estimates, though still horrific. It is generally accepted to be greater than 14,000 people killed.
The brutality was so intense and the internal backlash so severe that it threatened to destabilize the regime. In 1956, the leadership in Hanoi actually had to publicly apologize.
Ho Chi Minh admitted to excesses and mistakes, right?
Yes, and they instituted a rectification of errors campaign to try and release some prisoners and restore some land, really just to keep the peasantry from entirely revolting against them.
So if you zoom out for a second, you have these two very harsh, uncompromising, highly paranoid regimes facing off across the 17th parallel. And the division at Geneva wasn't clean.
No, not at all.
When the Viet Minh regrouped to the north in 1954, they deliberately left thousands of highly trained political cadres, basically covert operatives, hidden in the south, along with massive secret weapons caches buried in the jungle.
These were the sleeper cells. And by 1957, as Diem's repression intensified, these hidden insurgents in the south began to fight back. They launched a targeted, gruesome assassination campaign against Diem's government infrastructure.
They called it the extermination of traitors. They weren't fighting large battles. They were operating entirely in the shadows. They were killing village chiefs, school teachers, rural health workers, agricultural advisors. Anyone who represented the Saigon government's authority in the countryside was a target.
The violence was escalating rapidly, and Hanoi is watching all of this. In January 1959, the North Vietnamese Communist Party Central Committee holds a secret meeting and formally approves a people's war to overthrow the Southern government.
They authorize armed struggle, and to support this, in May 1959, they establish a specialized logistical unit called Group 559.
Their sole objective was to figure out a way to secretly move men, weapons, and supplies from the north, bypass the heavily militarized 17th parallel, and get them to the insurgents in the south.
And the only way to do that was to go completely off the map. They start hacking footpaths through the incredibly dense, mountainous jungles of neighboring, officially neutral Laos and Cambodia.
This is the birth of what the Americans would later call the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
At first, it's literally just guys carrying rifles on their backs through the mud.
It starts small, but it becomes the most sophisticated logistical network in the history of guerrilla warfare. And to organize the fighting in the South, in December 1960, Hanoi formally directs the creation of the National Liberation Front, the NLF.
This is the group that the U.S. and South Vietnam universally referred to as the Viet Cong, or the VC.
Exactly. The VC was deliberately designed to look like a broad-based, spontaneous Southern uprising. It was an umbrella organization meant to unite all anti-Diem dissidents, communists and non-communists alike.
Which essentially masks the direct command and control coming from Hanoi.
Precisely. Their publicly stated goal was simply the withdrawal of American imperial influence and the overthrow of the dictatorial Diem government.
Which perfectly brings us to the United States and the arrival of President John F. Kennedy. It's 1961. Kennedy enters the Oval Office, and he inherits this bubbling cauldron in Southeast Asia.
And you really have to understand the immense psychological pressure Kennedy is under at this time. His first year is a disaster.
Oh, yeah. He signs off on the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, which is a humiliating failure. He watches the Soviet Union build the Berlin Wall. He's heading toward the Cuban Missile Crisis.
He is being heavily criticized by domestic hardliners for being too soft on communism.
So Kennedy feels an intense political and strategic need to draw a hard line in the sand somewhere. He needs to prove American resolve to the Soviets, and Vietnam becomes that place.
Kennedy was a firm, unquestioning believer in the domino theory. He genuinely believed that if South Vietnam fell, it would trigger a chain reaction. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all falling to communism one by one.
But Kennedy is also cautious, right? He is initially very resistant to the idea of sending American ground combat troops to fight in Asian jungles. He tells his advisors that it's their war, they have to win it.
So his strategy is massive escalation, but strictly in the form of military assistance, money, and advisors.
The word advisor does a lot of heavy lifting here.
A ton of heavy lifting. When Eisenhower left office, there were about 900 American military advisors in Vietnam. By the time Kennedy is assassinated in November 1963, that number had surged to over 16,000 American military personnel on the ground.
That's a huge jump. And they aren't just giving advice in a boardroom. They are flying helicopters, they are accompanying South Vietnamese forces on combat missions, and they are taking casualties.
But despite all this new American hardware, the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, is deeply struggling. They are plagued by terrible leadership. Diem promotes officers based entirely on their political loyalty to his family, not their military competence.
The corruption is rampant, and the Viet Cong are winning the battle for the countryside.
So looking for a silver bullet to counter the rural insurgency, the U.S. and Diem's government launched the Strategic Hamlet Program in 1961.
Right, let's talk about this. The overarching doctrine was to physically separate the peasant population from the Viet Cong, cutting off the insurgents' access to food, shelter, and recruits.
That was the theory.
This strategy just seems so fundamentally, obviously flawed when you think about human nature. The mechanics of it were brutal. The government would forcibly relocate entire rural farming communities,
They would literally burn down their ancestral villages.
uproot them from the land where their ancestors were buried, which is incredibly culturally significant in Vietnam, and force them to move into these new fortified settlements surrounded by bamboo spikes and barbed wire.
The theory was to create safe zones where the government could provide security, education, and medical care. But in practice, it was a disaster.
Right. I mean, isn't this like trying to cure a patient's headache by locking them in a cage? You are forcibly uprooting farmers from their livelihoods. You are basically imprisoning them in their own country.
The forced labor required to build the fences bred massive resentment.
You aren't winning hearts and minds. You are actively radicalizing the rural population and making them hate the very government that is supposedly trying to save them from communism.
It was a catastrophic failure of counterinsurgency doctrine. The Viet Cong easily infiltrated the hamlets anyway. They would often just recruit the angry farmers inside the wire.
The program was widely hated by the peasantry, and by 1963, the entire initiative essentially collapsed under its own weight.
But the true breaking point for Diem's regime didn't actually come from the Viet Cong in the countryside. The fatal blow came from his own domestic policies in the cities.
The Buddhist crisis of 1963, this is the match in the powder keg.
Yes. Remember, Ngo Dinh Diem and his inner circle are devout, aristocratic Catholics in a country where a vast majority of the population, perhaps 70 to 80%, practices Buddhism.
For years, Diem had been heavily favoring Catholics in military promotions, government jobs, and land distribution. The resentment had been building for a long time.
It explodes in May 1963 in the city of Hue. Buddhists are gathered to celebrate Vesak, the birthday of the Buddha. But the government decides to enforce an obscure law banning the flying of religious flags.
The Buddhists protest, pointing out that Catholic flags were flown freely during government events just weeks prior. The protests grow, and government security forces fire directly into the crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 9 people, including children.
This sparks massive nationwide demonstrations. Buddhist monks lead marches in Saigon. And Diem, entirely trapped in his own paranoia and urged on by his hardline brother, Nguyen Nu, utterly refuses to compromise. He blames the Viet Cong for the unrest.
And it creates one of the most shocking images of the 20th century. In June 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sits down in the middle of a busy intersection in Saigon. Another monk pours gasoline over him.
He calmly strikes a match and burns himself to death in protest of the regime's religious persecution.
A journalist captures the photo, and it is on the front page of every newspaper in the world the next day. Kennedy sees it in the Oval Office and is reportedly horrified.
And incredibly, the Diem regime makes it worse. In August, ARVN Special Forces, taking direct orders from Diem's brother Nu, launched coordinated violent midnight raids on Buddhist pagodas across the country.
They smash statues, arrest thousands of monks, and cause massive destruction. This is the absolute turning point for Washington.
The U.S. officials on the ground realize that Diem is completely alienating the entire population. He is spending more resources fighting monks than fighting the communist insurgency.
The U.S. State Department concludes that the war cannot be won with Diem in power. They decide to push for regime change. They draft a highly classified message known as Cable 243 and send it to the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr.
Cable 243 essentially tells the CIA to quietly contact dissident generals within the South Vietnamese military. The message is clear. If you launch a coup against Diem, the United States will not intervene to stop you, and we will not cut off your military aid afterward.
It was a green light.
It absolutely does.
And so the generals move. In early November 1963, military units surround the presidential palace. Diem and his brother flee through a secret tunnel, but they are captured the next morning.
And despite promises of safe exile, they are brutally murdered in the back of an armored personnel carrier.
The historical records show that President Kennedy was genuinely shocked and dismayed when he received the news. He had authorized their removal from power, but he had not anticipated that the generals would actually execute a head of state.
This sequence of events raises a deeply important question, and if we connect this to the broader geopolitical picture, it highlights a fatal flaw in American strategy. Washington orchestrated Diem's removal because they believed he was an obstacle to winning the war. But strategically, assassinating Diem actually worked completely against U.S. interests in the long run.
How so? I mean, the guy was a corrupt dictator who was alienating his own people. Wasn't he a liability?
He was a massive liability.
Oh.
But whatever Diem's many faults were, his authoritarianism, his paranoia, his repression, he possessed one thing that could not be easily replaced: impeccable nationalist credentials.
Ah.
He was a recognized, historic Vietnamese leader who had demonstrably fought against French colonialism. He wasn't French's puppet, and he fought hard not to be seen as an American puppet either. Once you remove him from the board, you plunge South Vietnam into extreme, chronic political instability.
The vacuum is huge.
Massive. The military junta that replaces Diem is overthrown in another coup just 3 months later. Over the next 2 years, there is a dizzying revolving door of unstable, corrupt military governments in Saigon.
And to the communist north and to many peasants in the south, these new generals in Saigon look like nothing more than hired mercenaries entirely propped up by American dollars. They had zero political legitimacy.
And the chaos isn't just in Saigon. Just 3 weeks after Diem is killed, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas.
The nation is completely traumatized. Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in on Air Force One, and he inherits a situation in South Vietnam that is rapidly, completely deteriorating.
The ARVN is paralyzed by the coup. The Viet Cong are taking over entire provinces.
With South Vietnam politically destabilized, the U.S. feels profoundly compelled to step in directly to prevent a total, humiliating collapse. We are entering the era of the Americanization of the war.
The leadership in Hanoi recognized the chaos in the South immediately. They saw their window. They decide to drastically escalate.
They stop relying solely on the Viet Cong guerrillas and begin sending regular, fully uniformed regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, the official North Vietnamese army marching down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to fight in the South.
Hanoi shifts to a strategy of seeking a decisive, rapid military victory before the United States can fully mobilize and intervene.
But the U.S. does intervene, and the catalyst they use to justify it is the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. Okay, let's really unpack this, because the details of what actually happened versus what the public was told are just staggering.
It's early August. An American destroyer, the USS Maddox, is conducting an electronic intelligence gathering mission just off the coast of North Vietnam.
On August 2nd, the Maddox is approached by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Maddox fires warning shots, the boats launch torpedoes, there is a brief skirmish, and the boats retreat.
That event, on August 2nd, undeniably happened. The ship was hit by a single machine gun bullet. But it is what supposedly happened 2 days later, on the pitch-black night of August 4th, that fundamentally changed world history.
Right. On August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the Turner Joy, are back out in the Gulf. The weather is terrible. There are massive thunderstorms, high waves, and zero visibility.
Suddenly, the sonar operators start reporting that they are under attack.
The ships start zigzagging wildly in the dark, firing hundreds of artillery shells into the empty ocean, dropping depth charges, chasing phantom radar blips. Based on the frantic reports from this chaotic night, President Johnson goes on national television.
He tells the American public that U.S. ships have been the victim of an unprovoked attack on the high seas. He goes to Congress and asks for a resolution.
And Congress gives it to him almost unanimously. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is passed on August 7th. It essentially gives Lyndon Johnson a blank check.
It grants the president the legal authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack and prevent further aggression, without ever asking Congress for a formal declaration of war.
But the crucial, devastating detail that comes from reviewing the historical intelligence files is that a deeply classified 2005 National Security Agency report definitively confirmed that the August 4th attack never actually happened.
There were no North Vietnamese boats anywhere near the American ships that night.
It was an entire battle manufactured by a misinterpretation of faulty radar returns, freak weather effects, and overly anxious sonar operators hearing the ship's own propellers and thinking they were incoming torpedoes.
Even President Johnson eventually realized the truth. Years later, he privately joked to a State Department official, "For all I know, our Navy was out there shooting at whales."
Shooting at flying fish was another way he put it. And yet, that phantom attack in the dark became the foundational legal justification that launched a massive, decade-long ground war.
It's just haunting. Armed with that resolution, LBJ crosses the Rubicon. In March 1965, the first 3,500 United States Marines land on the beaches at Da Nang.
Ostensibly, they're just there to protect the air bases. But the mission creep is instantaneous. Within a month, they are authorized to conduct offensive operations.
The numbers just absolutely explode from there. By the end of 1965, there are nearly 200,000 American troops in the country. By 1968, the troop presence hits a peak over 536,000 young Americans slogging through the jungle.
And alongside the massive ground escalation, Johnson authorizes Operation Rolling Thunder. This is a massive, sustained, multi-year aerial bombardment campaign targeting North Vietnam.
The strategic goal was to destroy their industrial base, bomb their transportation networks, and inflict so much pain that Hanoi would beg to stop supporting the insurgency in the South.
But the bombing wasn't restricted to Vietnam. The U.S. military realizes that the men and weapons are flowing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which runs primarily through Laos.
So in a desperate attempt to sever that artery, the United States engages in a covert, deeply secret bombing campaign over neutral Laos.
The sheer scale of this is almost incomprehensible to the human mind. Between 1964 and 1973, the U.S. military dropped 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos. To put that into historical perspective, that is roughly equivalent to the 2.1 million tons of bombs that the United States dropped on all of Europe and all of Asia combined during the entirety of World War II.
It made Laos, a small, agrarian nation, the most heavily bombed country per capita in the history of the world.
They were dropping a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years, and yet, despite this apocalyptic level of aerial destruction, it didn't work.
The flow of men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail never stopped. It barely even slowed down.
How is that even possible? How do you drop 2 million tons of explosives on a dirt path and not stop bicycles?
Because it wasn't a single dirt path. It was a braided network of thousands of miles of trails hidden beneath triple canopy jungle. When American bombers destroyed one section, thousands of local laborers, women, and youth volunteers would emerge from underground bunkers and repair the road overnight.
Or simply cut a new path 50 yards away.
Exactly. They moved primarily at night. They lived in massive subterranean tunnel complexes that contained hospitals and fuel depots. It was a triumph of sheer human endurance over industrialized technology.
So if the bombing isn't stopping the supply, what is the strategy on the ground in the South? The U.S. military is commanded by General William Westmoreland, and his entire strategic philosophy is based on a concept of attrition.
He looked at the vast American advantages in firepower, mobility, and logistics, and he believes the U.S. can simply kill enemy combatants faster than North Vietnam can physically replace them.
It's a grisly mathematical formula. He believes there is a crossover point, and once they hit it, the enemy will inevitably collapse.
This strategy of attrition is what elevates the concept of the body count to become the central overriding metric of the entire American war effort.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean deeply systemically tragic. The sheer absurdity of the body count metric. In World War II, you measured success by pushing front lines forward. You captured a beach, you took a hill, you liberated Paris, you pushed toward Berlin.
But in a guerrilla war with no front lines, the military bureaucracy decided the only way to measure success was to count how many dead bodies you left in the jungle.
Exactly. When you strip away territorial gain as a metric, all you are left with is mortality. If you measure success purely by how many enemies you kill, rather than whether a province is actually secure or whether the civilian population feels safe from retaliation, you're inherently incentivizing the wrong kind of war.
It creates perverse, deeply corrupting incentives down the entire chain of command.
It's like measuring how well a business is doing by how much paper they shred. It tells you there is a lot of loud, violent activity happening, but it tells you absolutely nothing about actual progress.
Officers' careers, their promotions, their medals were directly tied to producing high body counts. This immense pressure trickled down to the teenage grunts in the field. If an artillery strike wiped out a village, there was intense pressure to classify every dead civilian as a Viet Cong killed in action just to boost the numbers on the weekly report to Saigon.
This strategy of attrition was physically carried out through tactics called search and destroy missions. Utilizing their massive fleet of helicopters, U.S. forces would fly deep into hostile territory, search for a concentration of Viet Cong, destroy them using overwhelming artillery and air support, and then pack up and fly back to their secure base before dark.
They rarely held the territory they just fought for.
A prime example of this futility is Operation Masher in 1966. It was designed to be the largest, most aggressive search and destroy operation to that point, taking place in Binh Dinh province.
Tens of thousands of U.S. and ARVN troops swept through the area.
The destruction was massive. To deny the enemy cover, they uprooted villages, burned crops, and ended up displacing roughly 125,000 civilians, turning them into destitute refugees living in squalid camps outside the cities.
And the operational impact of all this destruction. The historical records show that the Viet Cong and PAVN forces simply retreated into the mountains, waited for the Americans to leave, and moved right back into the exact same province 4 months later.
The area was just as contested as before, only now the civilian population was completely traumatized and entirely hostile to the Americans.
This perfectly highlights the profound tactical mismatch that doomed the American war effort. The U.S. military was a highly mechanized conventional force. From the generals down to the sergeants, they were institutionally trained and psychologically prepared for offensive World War II-style combat against an enemy that stood up and fought in mass formations.
They were wholly unsuited for a defensive, patient, deeply political counterinsurgency war.
Right. Because the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were not trying to win World War II. They were employing a strategy of protracted warfare, heavily influenced by Mao Zedong.
They knew they could never defeat the United States in a conventional battle of firepower, but they also knew they didn't have to.
They just needed to survive. They needed to bleed the Americans, drag the conflict out for years, and simply outlast American political will back home.
And the data from the conflict proves that the communists were the ones actually controlling the pace of the war. Despite all the American helicopters, the napalm, and the 500,000 troops, the VC and PAVN retained the strategic initiative.
Analysis shows that the communist forces initiated nearly 90% of all large-scale firefights. They dictated the terms of engagement. If they wanted to fight, they ambushed. If they were outgunned, they slipped away into the jungle or the tunnels.
But that grinding, frustrating reality on the ground, the fact that the U.S. was caught in an endless game of bloody whack-a-mole, was absolutely not the story being told back in the United States.
President Johnson and General Westmoreland employed a deliberate public relations policy of, as internal memos called it, minimum candor.
They were constantly aggressively touting progress. They would hold press conferences highlighting the massive enemy body counts to claim that the crossover point had been reached and victory was just around the corner.
General Westmoreland famously traveled back to the United States in late November 1967. He gave a highly publicized speech at the National Press Club in Washington. He confidently told the American public that the enemy's hopes were bankrupt, and he explicitly said, "The end begins to come into view."
He painted a picture of a weakened enemy on the brink of total collapse.
But every night on the evening news, American citizens were watching unvarnished combat footage. They were seeing flag-draped coffins coming home. They were reading reports from journalists in the field describing a stalemate.
This massive jarring disconnect between the official government optimism and the increasingly grim reality created what became known as the credibility gap. The American public fundamentally began to realize they were being lied to.
The foundation of public trust was severely cracking in 1967. But that credibility gap is about to be violently ripped wide open. The disconnect between Washington's rhetoric and the reality in Vietnam reaches its explosive, world-altering breaking point in the very first month of 1968.
We are, of course, talking about the Tet Offensive, and the setup for this operation by the North Vietnamese is just incredibly calculated. It's a masterclass in deception.
In late 1967, the North Vietnamese army deliberately begins massing troops and launching heavy artillery attacks on remote, isolated American outposts along the borders of South Vietnam, places like Dak Tor in the Central Highlands, and the famous Marine combat base at Khe Sanh near the DMZ.
It was a classic, massive diversionary tactic. The North Vietnamese command deliberately wanted to draw American attention, American logistical focus, and crucially, American combat battalions away from the major, heavily populated coastal cities.
General Westmoreland was convinced that Khe Sanh was going to be the American Dien Bien Phu, that the communists were trying to overrun a major base. So he poured 50,000 troops and massive air power into defending the borders.
And the diversion completely worked. American eyes were looking outward at the jungle. Then, in late January 1968, the holiday of Tet arrives. This is the Lunar New Year, the most important cultural holiday in Vietnam.
Traditionally, both sides observed a strict informal truce during Tet. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were given leave to go home to their villages. The cities were completely relaxed.
And that is exactly when the communists strike. In the early morning hours, more than 85,000 Viet Cong and regular North Vietnamese troops abandon their jungle sanctuaries and launch highly coordinated, massive surprise attacks on over 100 cities, towns, and military bases simultaneously across all of South Vietnam.
The sheer scale of the offensive and the immense covert planning required to pull it off was staggering. For months, the Viet Cong had been smuggling weapons into the major cities hidden beneath vegetables in market carts or concealed inside fake coffins during funeral processions.
Thousands of fighters had slipped into Saigon in civilian clothes, waiting for the signal. They attacked the presidential palace. They attacked the national radio station.
And most shockingly of all, a specialized Viet Cong sapper squad blasted a hole in the outer wall of the heavily fortified United States Embassy compound in Saigon. They fought a bloody gun battle on the embassy lawn for hours before being killed.
When you look at the failure of intelligence on the part of the CIA and military command, the Tet Offensive is frequently and accurately compared to Pearl Harbor.
It was a massive intelligence failure, basically a Cold War Pearl Harbor. The fighting that erupted across the country was incredibly fierce, but nowhere was it more devastating than in the Battle of Hue.
Hue was the beautiful, ancient, former imperial capital of Vietnam, located near the border. The communists easily overran the city on the first day, raising their flag over the historic citadel, and the combat to retake that city lasted for 26 brutal, agonizing days.
It was house-to-house, room-to-room urban combat, something the U.S. Marines hadn't seen since Seoul and the Korean War. And it is vital to look at the historical facts and impartially report the sheer atrocities committed by both sides during this battle.
During the nearly 4 weeks that the Viet Cong and PAVN controlled Hue, political cadres went door-to-door with meticulously prepared blacklists. They rounded up government officials, school teachers, Catholic priests, and foreigners.
They systematically executed approximately 2,800 unarmed civilians and prisoners of war, dumping their bodies into mass graves. It was a calculated purge of anyone deemed a spy or a class enemy.
It was horrifying. And conversely, the effort to retake the city by American and South Vietnamese forces involved unleashing such massive, indiscriminate, overwhelming firepower, calling in naval artillery strikes and dropping napalm on residential neighborhoods, that 80% of the historic city of Hue was reduced to absolute rubble.
The civilian death toll from the crossfire and the bombing was massive. It was a scene of absolute devastation.
Now, if we step back and look at the immediate military outcome, the Tet Offensive was actually a catastrophic tactical defeat for North Vietnam.
The Viet Cong essentially threw themselves against the full weight of American firepower. They suffered staggering casualties, an estimated 45,000 to 50,000 fighters killed in a matter of weeks.
The Viet Cong infrastructure in the South was virtually wiped out, and from that point on, the war was fought almost entirely by regular North Vietnamese army units. Furthermore, their primary strategic objectives totally failed.
Hanoi had genuinely believed that their offensive would spark a massive spontaneous uprising among the civilian population in the South, and that the South Vietnamese army would mutiny and defect. Neither of those things happened. The population mostly just hid in terror.
So militarily, the communists lost the battle. But strategically and politically, it was an absolute masterstroke. The psychological shockwave it sent across the Pacific was insurmountable.
Even though the U.S. militarily repelled the attacks, wiped out the attackers, and recaptured every single city, the visual narrative completely overwhelmed the military reality.
The living room television screens back in America showed a war that looked completely chaotically out of control. It proves that in modern war, perception is reality. You cannot have your top general stand in front of the cameras in November and promise that the end comes into view, and then just 8 weeks later have the American public watch footage of the enemy shooting their way into the grounds of their own embassy in the supposedly secure capital city.
What's truly fascinating here is the internal politics in Hanoi that drove this massive gamble. The northern leader at the time, Le Duan, who had largely sidelined Ho Chi Minh by this point, pushed aggressively for the Tet Offensive because he was facing intense internal criticism over the grinding, costly stalemate.
He desperately wanted a decisive, war-winning military victory.
When it failed militarily, it accidentally succeeded politically beyond his wildest dreams by fundamentally breaking the spine of American public support for the war.
The political fallout in Washington is immediate and devastating. General Westmoreland, facing this crisis and fearing a second wave of attacks, actually secretly convenes his staff to consider moving tactical nuclear weapons into South Vietnam under a highly classified contingency plan called Operation Fracture Jaw.
When the White House found out that Westmoreland was even studying the logistics of deploying nuclear weapons, President Johnson was reportedly furious and terrified. He immediately ordered the operation shut down, fearing it would trigger World War III with China.
Then Westmoreland makes a fatal political error. Through military channels, he requests an additional 206,000 troops to exploit the enemy's losses. This massive troop request gets leaked to the press.
And the American public is absolutely outraged. They're thinking, wait a minute, you just told us we wiped out the enemy and won the Battle of Tet. Why do you suddenly need 250,000 more men if we are winning?
The credibility gap becomes a chasm. Westmoreland is quietly removed from his command in March and essentially kicked upstairs to become Army Chief of Staff.
And the political casualties reach all the way to the absolute top. The anti-war movement in the U.S. reaches a fever pitch. President Johnson's approval ratings plummet into the abyss. The war he escalated has entirely consumed his presidency.
He is facing primary challenges from within his own party. Finally, at the end of March 1968, in a shocking, nationally televised address, Johnson announces a partial halt to the bombing of the North, and then stuns the world by stating he will not seek and will not accept the nomination of his party for another term as president.
The Tet Offensive effectively broke the political will of the Johnson administration. So, recognizing that a military victory is no longer politically viable, the U.S. is forced to the negotiating table. Peace talks finally begin in Paris in May 1968.
But anyone hoping for a quick resolution was deeply mistaken. The war is far from over. As we enter the years 1969 to 1975, we enter the final, and in many ways, the darkest, most cynical chapter of the conflict.
Richard Nixon wins the 1968 presidential election. He campaigned on the vague promise that he had a secret plan to end the war with honor. Once in office, his overarching strategy becomes known as Vietnamization.
Right. Nixon is a shrewd political operator. He realizes that the American public will simply no longer tolerate the high rate of U.S. casualties. The draft is tearing the country apart. So Vietnamization means slowly, steadily withdrawing American ground combat troops, while simultaneously pumping massive amounts of training, modern equipment, and money into the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, with the goal that they can eventually take over the burden of fighting the ground war themselves.
But Nixon isn't just retreating. He is deeply concerned about looking weak. He wants to force North Vietnam to accept peace terms favorable to the United States. To do this, he employs a psychological strategy that he literally called the madman theory.
He wanted the communist leadership in Hanoi and Moscow to think he was erratic, volatile, and capable of absolutely anything, including using nuclear weapons to win the war.
In October 1969, he actually ordered a squadron of B-52 bombers armed with live thermonuclear weapons to take off and race toward the border of Soviet airspace just to try and scare the Soviets into cutting off their massive logistical supply to North Vietnam.
It's an insane gamble, and it didn't work. The Soviets were alarmed, but they didn't flinch, and they kept supplying Hanoi. But Nixon doesn't stop there. He also expands the conventional war in secret, drastically escalating the violence while telling the public he is winding it down. He orders Operation Menu, a massive, highly classified bombing campaign targeting communist sanctuaries and supply depots hiding just across the border in neutral Cambodia.
And he kept it secret from Congress and the American public for over a year by falsifying the flight logs of the bombers. But the bombing wasn't enough. In April 1970, Nixon authorizes a massive joint U.S.-South Vietnamese ground invasion into Cambodia to physically hunt down the Viet Cong command bases.
When the American public finds out that the war is actually physically expanding into a new country, Cambodia, at the exact time they were promised a drawdown, the domestic protests absolutely explode. Millions of college students strike.
This directly leads to the tragedy at Kent State University in May 1970. Ohio National Guardsmen, facing a crowd of protesting students, opened fire with live ammunition, killing 4 unarmed students and wounding 9 others. The country feels like it is literally tearing itself apart at the seams. And this domestic turmoil, this complete breakdown of civic cohesion, is perfectly mirroring what is happening internally to the United States military over in Vietnam.
This is a crucial, dark, and often overlooked aspect of the later years of the war. Between 1969 and 1971, as the troop drawdowns began, the United States military in Vietnam experienced a systemic, near-total collapse of morale and discipline. The military wasn't just losing public support back home, it was rotting from the inside out in the jungle.
The statistics are horrifying for military planners. Desertion rates quadrupled, absenteeism was rampant, and drug abuse became a massive, crippling epidemic. It is estimated that roughly 30% of U.S. troops were regularly using heavy marijuana, which was cheap and plentiful. Even worse, a congressional subcommittee investigation found that up to 10% of American soldiers in Vietnam were actively addicted to highly pure, cheap heroin that was flooding into the country.
You also see the complete breakdown of the chain of command. Entire units would occasionally flat out refuse direct orders from their commanders to go on combat patrols. A much more common practice was called sandbagging. A platoon would be ordered out into the dangerous jungle to search for the enemy. But instead of patrolling, they would walk just a few hundred yards outside the wire, find a safe spot out of sight, set up a secure perimeter, and spend 3 days smoking weed and radioing in fake patrol coordinates to headquarters. They jokingly called it search and avoid.
It was a survival tactic. And the most extreme, terrifying manifestation of this breakdown in discipline was fragging.
The details on this are chilling. Fragging was the practice of enlisted soldiers attempting to assassinate their own superior officers. They usually used fragmentation grenades, hence the name fragging, because a grenade explosion destroys all forensic evidence, unlike a bullet with ballistic markings. If a young, aggressive new lieutenant arrived in country and started ordering his exhausted, cynical platoon into dangerous firefights just to boost his own career, someone might roll a grenade under his bunk at night. The military formally investigated nearly 900 incidents of fragging between 1969 and 1972, resulting in dozens of deaths. When soldiers are murdering their own commanders and radioing in fake patrols, the war isn't just lost militarily, it's lost spiritually.
This raises a deeply profound question about the nature of warfare. How do you maintain a conscript army's discipline, morale, and willingness to die when every single soldier knows the war is winding down and the U.S. has already decided to leave? No soldier on earth wants to be the absolute last man to die in a war that their own government has already deemed a mistake. The overarching political strategy of Vietnamization basically transmitted a signal to the grunts on the ground that their continued presence and their potential sacrifice was ultimately futile. They were just buying time for politicians.
And the public's trust in the government takes another massive, unrecoverable hit in 1971 with the explosive leak of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. This was a massive, top-secret Department of Defense internal history of American involvement in the war. And it provided documentary proof that 4 successive presidential administrations had systematically, deliberately lied to the public and to Congress about the scope, the goals, and the utter lack of success of the war for decades.
The end game finally arrives in 1972. Realizing that the vast majority of U.S. ground combat troops have withdrawn, North Vietnam launches the Easter Offensive. This wasn't a guerrilla attack, it was a massive conventional invasion of the South utilizing hundreds of Soviet-supplied tanks and heavy artillery.
But the South Vietnamese army, backed by massive American air power, manages to hold the line. President Nixon responds with unprecedented fury. He orders Operation Linebacker and later Linebacker II in December 1972. This is the infamous Christmas bombing. The U.S. sends fleets of B-52s to heavily bomb the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong, targeting rail yards, power plants, and docks. The destruction is immense, and it draws international condemnation. But this massive display of brute force finally compels North Vietnam to seriously finalize the negotiations. They signed the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973.
The accords established a ceasefire. They allowed for the return of American prisoners of war, and they dictated the complete withdrawal of all remaining U.S. military personnel by March 1973. Nixon declared they had achieved peace with honor, but everyone involved knew it was a deeply flawed, cynical agreement. Crucially, while the U.S. was required to leave, the treaty allowed approximately 200,000 regular North Vietnamese troops to remain positioned inside the borders of South Vietnam.
It was a death sentence for the South. So the United States packs up and leaves, but the war absolutely does not end. The ceasefire breaks down almost immediately. South Vietnam is now fighting entirely alone. They are struggling with severe hyperinflation, massive corruption under President Thieu, and Congress in Washington drastically cuts their military funding. Meanwhile, North Vietnam takes this pause to completely rebuild and pave the Ho Chi Minh Trail, turning it into a modern highway capable of moving tank divisions.
And in the spring of 1975, Hanoi launches their final massive offensive. The South Vietnamese army, completely demoralized, out of ammunition, and realizing that American air support is never coming back, simply disintegrates. The collapse happens in a matter of mere weeks, far faster than anyone in Washington or Hanoi anticipated.
It ends in April 1975. The frantic, chaotic evacuation of the U.S. Embassy, helicopters pushing off the roof into the sea, and then North Vietnamese tanks literally crash through the iron gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war is over.
The geopolitical labyrinth had finally collapsed.
The scale of this conflict is just staggering. It is difficult to fully comprehend. We are talking about millions of Vietnamese dead soldiers, guerrillas, and countless civilians. Over 58,000 American service members killed, and hundreds of thousands more wounded physically and psychologically. Hundreds of thousands of deaths in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. Billions of dollars spent, fueling inflation that wrecked the U.S. economy. 3 ancient countries irrevocably changed, and a global nuclear superpower profoundly humbled on the world stage.
The trauma of the war sent shockwaves through history. It triggered massive, tragic refugee crises, the boat people fleeing the new communist regime. It destabilized the region, directly facilitating the rise of the Khmer Rouge and the subsequent genocide in Cambodia. The dominoes did fall, but not in the neat, predictable way Washington has theorized.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today on this deep dive, peeling back the layers from those early OSS meetings in the jungle all the way to the fall of Saigon. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that we haven't touched on yet. Consider the deep psychological scar left on the United States, a cultural and political phenomenon often called Vietnam Syndrome.
It is a profound, deeply ingrained aversion to American overseas military intervention, and a deep, lingering, almost structural distrust of government institutions, the military brass, and the intelligence community.
Think about how that profound loss of faith shaped the global policies of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We went into Vietnam obsessed with the domino theory, terrified that if one small nation fell to communism, the rest of the free world would follow. But looking back at the wreckage, the lies, the body counts, and the shredded constitution, you have to ask yourself, did the immense, destructive effort to prevent falling dominoes in Asia ultimately knock over the most important domino of all American civic trust back home?
It's a powerful question, and one we are still grappling with today.
And it brings us right back to where we started. The next time you hear Fortunate Son on the radio or see a movie with a Huey helicopter skimming over the jungle, remember that underneath that familiar cultural touchstone is a dizzying, tragic labyrinth of decisions, deceptions, and staggering human cost that is still fundamentally shaping our world today.